I wanted to begin our fourth lecture by revisiting butter. In this lecture which will be a short lecture, we're going to mostly discuss cheese, but let's pick up where we left off with other dairy products. Mostly because I wanted to show you these two great photographs that I found. On the left, we see what I believe is a North African woman suspending a goat skin on a tripod to make her butter inside the goat skin. And on the right, I believe a Palestinian woman also using a animal hide as a vessel for creation of the butter. And you can see there's this rocking or smacking back and forth of the hide, the mechanical disruption that's necessary for the butter formation. So what my title is here, Ancient Technology, Interesting Chemistry. Butter has been around a long time and probably accidentally discovered, just because of the use of animal skins as storage media and the use of milk as a nutrient source. What we observe is, upon mechanical disruption, the breaking of emulsified fat globules in the milk. So remember, milk is an oil in water emulsion. Fat globules coated with proteins and glycerophospholipids can interact with the aqueous phase. But as those fats inside, the triglycerides inside the globule, begin to crystallize and grow, they can smash out of their shell and form a continuous phase, and this is effectively a flipping or an inversion of the emulsion to water as the dispersed phase in a continuous butterfat phase. As we saw in a video that we previously checked out, handmade butter can be a lot looser construction than the commercially available butter that we see in the store. Frequently now we use centrifugation to separate the aqueous or water phase away from that fat phase, making a much firmer butter. What else to say though? Historically, fermentation was just impossible to avoid. Yes, so butter is typically cultured, at least historically was typically cultured, and part of the reason is that there are always these fermenting organisms and anaerobes in our environment, and it's hard to keep them away before the advent of modern sterilization and pasteurization methods. That's not a bad thing. It affects the flavor, usually considered in an interesting way. Another modern innovation is a switch from buttermilk as the aqueous phase that's poured off of the fatty phase as we make butter, to something that's more of a processed product, a milk product that's been manipulated, and no longer the usual butter, the old-fashioned buttermilk. While we're talking about substituting new processes and products for old, I wanted to mention some dairy substitutes, only a few that I'm going to mention here, mostly because they have some interesting characteristics. We mentioned margarine in the past as a substitute for butter. This is just processed vegetable oil, typically, which is normally white. So what are some interesting traits? Well, it's usually yellow, at least nowadays. The margarine is sold with the carotenoid pigments already mixed in. Typically, these pigments are fairly innocuous. Annatto is a seed from which we can derive this molecule bixin, which is a carotenoid pigment. Remember this long conjugated chain. Not exactly like some of the other carotenoids that we've seen, but very similar, giving it a nice yellowy color. What about the texture? There's a couple of ways of making margarine nowadays. Originally, simply the hydrogenation of liquid vegetable oils. So we remember that lots of animal and vegetable oils have one or more unsaturated bonds. That's a double bond between a couple of carbons. And the kinks that those unsaturated bonds leave in the molecule make for poor packing and therefore more liquid substances. In hydrogenation, we add hydrogens across that double bond, and that straightens out the chain, and we affect, again, the chemical and physical characteristics of those molecules. Now we pack tightly and can form a solid, which is a desirable characteristic in your breakfast spread. What about additives? Coming back to carotenoids, vitamin A is derived from the same molecule, from beta-carotene, and Uh, the annatto extract, Bixin, is not, you might imagine, might be a precursor molecule for vitamin A as well. Typically, what's added to these food substances are precursors of vitamin A, not vitamin A itself. But in this case, Bixin lacks the benzene ring here at the end of this molecule that would make it a vitamin A precursor. So some interesting details there as we consider margarine. Use of pigments, use of chemistry to modify the characteristics of the oil, and use of vitamin extracts to improve the nutritive characteristics of the food product. Another one that we've seen on the market fairly recently is fat-free half and half. This, is, of course, is not half and half at all, which is a milk-cream mixture, but is a mixture that's composed of milk as well as a variety of other compounds, including, of course, sugar, but also molecules like carrageenan, which is an anionic carbohydrate polymer. That is, it's a negatively charged carbohydrate polymer. It's a sugar chain, sugar polymer that's been modified with sulfate groups. But again, these long polymers, as we've seen, can affect the solution viscosity. So if we add large amounts of long polymers, we make the solution much more viscous, and that replicates the texture of real cream beverages without the fat. So that's what we're after here, is low fat in the diet. Now, I have tried fat-free half and half, and the texture does approach what we expect from half and half, but I'm not a regular consumer. Oh, one more dairy substitute that I wanted to mention was infant formula. Really became popular, invented late 19th century, really took off during the Second World War, I believe, when lots of women entered the workforce and nursing became less practicable or less socially acceptable, at least in that context. What we see with infant formula is a few different interesting ideas. We add back lactose. Of course, breast milk, human breast milk, is something like approximately 5% lactose. So we add lactose back to the infant formula. We also add cow milk protein components, not cow milk proper. We can very carefully control the amount of protein and the protein composition. That is to say, what kinds of protein make it into that formula. We can also supplement fats. We can replace the normal milk fats with vegetable oils. And of course, we add back a whole slew of vitamins to ensure the nutrient intake of the infant. Lots of other chemicals involved there as well. Not molecules that you might encounter in nature, but also maybe very important in terms of nutrition. Okay, there's a lot of cultural baggage associated with infant formula and breast milk and breastfeeding, so I wanted to take a second, a little detour to talk about that. There's a lot going on in this slide, so let's take it slow. There's been a great deal of research in the nutrient characteristics of breast milk, and certainly it's been recommended by a number of agencies that most women, unless there's compelling health reasons not to, breastfeed their offspring for the first 6 months to a year of life, and there's compelling science behind that. The health of the infant, generally speaking, seems to be greater when breastfed versus infant formula fed. And let's think about what some of the reasons are. Well, so what we mostly will focus on in this slide is the idea that there are prebiotic carbohydrates that are specific to the needs of the animal, right, or the infant, that can't be replaced easily based on our current understanding of milk composition and our current constructions or formulations of infant formula. So what I'm showing you here is a graph from a nice paper that shows the amount of Campylobacter diarrhea in infants as the amount of this particular carbohydrate is increased. This is a fucosyl lactose. It is an important component of human breast milk that is not found in infant formula. Right? It's unique to human breast milk. The idea here is that as we increase the amount of this carbohydrate, we see the amount of diarrhea, or the prevalence of diarrhea, decrease dramatically. So prevention of infection by the number one diarrhea-inducing bacterium, Campylobacter. There's some major biology going on here that we don't need to get into, but the bottom line is that this carbohydrate prevents the invasion of the GI tract by these bacteria, basically by blocking the sites where they might affix themselves to the GI tract. So on the one hand, we have the prevention of the establishment of bad bacteria, and you're probably aware that diarrhea is the number one cause of death around the world, infant mortality around the world. But there's a positive side as well, not just prevention, but also promotion of the proliferation of important critical bacteria. What we're looking at here in this slide is, here is an important carbohydrate present in human breast milk, not present in infant formula, and we look at the growth of a variety of bacterial strains. These are bifidobacteria. The bifidobacteria population changes in the human organism over the course of their life. There's a version that's present in infants, right? Infantis. There's versions that are present in adolescents and then in adults as well. And so what we see is that the presence of this carbohydrate promotes the development or the growth of this bacteria in the intestine of the growing infant. So that's what we mean by prebiotic. This is a molecule that promotes the establishment of the proper bacterial cultures or strains in the growing organism. Here are some other two little details that are kind of interesting. Human casein degradations. So just like calves are degrading the casein component in their mother's milk, so too human infants have specialized enzymes that are designed for degrading mother's milk. Human casein, as opposed to cow caseins, also have been found to affect the metabolism of the infant in a variety of interesting ways, including insulin uptake, so that means sugar consumption or sugar uptake. Additionally, there are issues that aren't necessarily so related to the specific composition, fat, protein, or sugar of the mother's milk compared to infant formula, but it's the treatment of milk that can affect the health of the infant. In particular, homogenization has been found to alter or impair the ability of the organism, the human infant, to absorb or uptake fat globules. So there's something specific about the structure of human milk. There are many specific details about the structure of human milk that make it an important food source for infants that is not really replaceable by formulas at this point. So an interesting milk interlude. Hope you don't mind. Thought that was fun. Let's talk about cooking with milk. Only a few things that I'll mention here amongst the slew of issues raised by your text. Something that we're all familiar with cooked milk is the formation of a skin. Anytime you try to make your own hot chocolate out of real milk on the stovetop, you might see the formation of a skin. And as we heat that milk, we have to be careful when we heat milk, of course, because we begin to denature lots of proteins. Denatured proteins aggregate and precipitate. And in this case, that doesn't mean precipitating out to the bottom of the bowl. It means floating to the surface, complexing with calcium and fat molecules as well, fat globules as well, and forming this yucky layer on the top. That's something we're all familiar with. We also can use milk to affect, as I've mentioned already, the viscosity of other things that we're cooking. Let's think about those. So milks are not necessarily a very good thickener. They themselves have a pretty low viscosity, and so they don't necessarily help improve a sauce characteristic very much. Creams are pretty good, though, as we use a very concentrated cream. Add that to our sauce, we can increase the viscosity, that is to say, reduce the flow of that solution. We can use emulsifiers in milk to help support other emulsions. So if an emulsion that we've created is perhaps unstable, we can add emulsifiers by adding milk that will help stabilize it. Reduced creams are also known to thicken sauces. What is a reduced cream? Well, you can take cream and carefully boil it or carefully reduce the volume by heating it, driving off the water, increasing the fat content dramatically. And because there's a um, higher fat content, will resist curdling, which is an important characteristic, as well as being able to thicken sauces very, very, very effectively. Phospholipids and proteins found in many sauces can help emulsify butterfat, so it's very nice in some sauces that are high in lipids and proteins to add a dollop of butter, and that butter immediately is dispersed by means of the natural emulsifiers present in that sauce, and thereby thickening the sauce. So we'll talk about sauces in great detail a little bit later in the semester, but we can see that creams and milks are very effective at altering the characteristics and flow of sauces. We've talked about foams pretty extensively. I'm just going to return to them, especially because latte and cafe latte and cappuccinos are important to my own life. Um, we know that in creams, when we make whipped cream, it's fat forming and at the air liquid interface, stabilizing the air bubbles that are whipped in. That stabilize those bubbles and stabilize the foam. When we use milk, um, we see that there is less fat, yes, but more protein, relatively speaking. And then when we apply steam or hot water, then what we begin to form is a protein coagulation network. And this is why we'll find that low-fat milks make a more resilient foam than high-fat milks. So, of course, there are competing issues there. You might like the flavor and texture of your latte made with a high-fat milk, but the foam is going to last longer if you use skim milk.